Good morning. This is Rich Sierra with Business SOS. I'm the president of the Florida Small Business Legal Center, located here in Boca Raton, Florida. This is episode number 18 of Business SOS. Before we start, I'd like you to participate in the show. If you have a legal question that you'd like me to address in the show, just please send me an email at richsierra.com. I'll be very happy to, if that question is selected and we select that for the show, I'll go ahead and send you an autographed copy of my book, Business SOS, 8 Common Legal Mistakes Business Owners Make and How to Avoid Them. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and you can ask for it at your local bookstores. At the last episode, I talked about franchises, and in the next few episodes, it's kind of a franchise series that we're going to be talking about. And because I think it is important, there are hundreds of thousands of thousands of franchises in the United States, but also business owners look at franchising as a way to get into business for the first time. And you see franchise expos all over the country. In fact, there's one in South Florida coming up in the next few weeks. So it is an important topic for you to know. And I want to go, last time I talked about, if you're looking to consider a franchise, what to consider outside of the franchise disclosure document. I'm going to talk today about the franchise disclosure document. It's also known as the FDD. And this is going to be like a 2 or 3 part series simply because there's so many items that we need to cover in the FDD that I'm not going to have time today on one podcast. But also it just makes it a very, very long podcast. And I want you to make sure that you have the opportunity perhaps in smaller segments to go over these documents. And also in the show notes, I'll have a link to see these documents and where I'm getting the reference from. In fact, I'm using a handout that I got directly from the Federal Trade Commission. It's Franchise Fundamentals. It's taking a deep dive into the franchise disclosure document. I want to make sure that what I provide to you is a source that is an authority source, but also a source you can rely upon. It's not my opinion. It's something that you can also look up and download as well and read up on your own. First of all, let's talk about what is the franchise disclosure document. This is a document required by the Federal Trade Commission that has to be given to you at least 14 days before you sign a franchise agreement or pay any money to the franchisor. These are 23 required disclosures that the franchisor has to make to you, and they're required, they're mandatory, and for you to basically evaluate the franchise. And as I mentioned to you before, these are required disclosures, but that does not mean that just looking at these disclosures will be sufficient for you, in my opinion, to determine whether or not pursuing the franchise might be a good investment, a good opportunity for you. All I'm doing here is just basically telling you these are required. When something is required, they're going to give you the minimum. Don't expect that the FDD will give you everything that you need to know about the franchise. That's sufficient. It is not. So, but I think it's important for you to know the FDD will give you very good information for you to ask more questions about the franchise and the franchisor. In many occasions, when people come to my office and we talk about, they purchased a franchise, things didn't go as well as they planned to. And let's face it, when people come to my office because something just didn't go right. So there are many times that people buy franchise, things go very well. There are many successful franchisors and franchisees. So it's nothing against franchises, but I just want to make you aware that you need to be cognizant and have the responsibility of reading the document and asking the right questions. And that's the reason I'm doing this podcast, is to basically to educate you and to give you additional tools that you have as a business owner to determine, okay, this is the right opportunity for me. Am I asking the right questions? And often, when people ask me, I want you to review the FDD for us and tell me what you think. I'm happy to do it. It's a service that we provide at the Florida Small Business Legal Center, but that is just not enough. But happy to do it. But also I asked the client, I'm happy to review it, but I want you to review it as well and write down questions that you may have so we can actually have a more intelligent conversation. me reading the document and just pointing things out to you, it's not going to be enough. I want you to review it. I want you to also highlight things that you do not understand, questions that you may have, and then we can actually go ahead and have a more higher level conversation that I think will be more productive for you, the client in this case. Why I do this, and I know I'm dating myself. Back in the 90s, there was a clothing company called Sims, and I believe they're no longer in business. They're closed down many years ago. But one of the taglines they had was, "An educated consumer is our best customer." They sell dress, men's clothing and suits. Using that same parallel, my best client is an educated client. Is when they have an understanding of what the issue is, understanding of contract law, and clearly they're not going to have an understanding at an expert level that I have. Been doing this for 18 years now, but they have an understanding sufficient enough to ask more questions, because by asking those questions, we'll be able to provide better answers and have more depth and be able to help the business owner, in this case you, to make better decisions. So let's go right into it. And I'm going to go over maybe 5 or 6 of these disclosures, simply because it won't be enough time, and also I want to break it down to smaller segments. And also in the show notes, as I mentioned before, if you want to have the entire document, I'm going to put a link to it so you can download it. It's right there. It's a public document that you can download at any time, and you can actually review it. There are 23 required disclosures that the FDD needs to have, the franchisor needs to disclose as part of the franchise disclosure document, the FDD. The first one, there will be the franchisor's background. You want to review, that's the background of the franchisor, how long the company has been around, when did they start, and how this concept came about. So if it's a pizza franchise, they usually have a theme. Maybe they started, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and then they decided to franchise the concept. Maybe they have a recipe, they might have a brand, a trademark, there might be only takeout. So that's just something you want to look. What is the background of the actual of the franchise itself? It is very common sometimes that you have a separate entity for the franchise, for the franchisor, than from the company that started the franchise. Let me explain. You have, using this example, and I use Domino's for instance. And I'm not sure this is the case, but say for example, if they have they started as a regular restaurant or regular takeout pizza place, but then they created a separate entity to become the franchisor. That is the one that licenses the franchise and provides the franchise agreements and also provides the trademark licensing. So sometimes you have that separation. Nothing wrong with that. It's simply you just want to make that when you look at the franchise entity might be newer than the entity that actually created the concept of the franchise. So look at the background of the franchises, how long they've been in business. Also Google them. Go online and basically type franchise name reviews. And if you also have, and I mentioned this before, if there's a local franchise, do be a secret shopper and go and check it out. That way you have, from the client experience, this is what your clients would experience if you become a franchisee. Number 2, the business background. Those are the background of the officers of the franchise. This is very, very important. Nowadays it's easier to get more information, but they have to disclose who are the officers of the franchisor, who owns the franchise entity, the background, their degrees, their experience, where they came from. All that information has to be disclosed as well in the franchise disclosure document. But also you have the ability to go and check out those names on LinkedIn. Don't just rely exclusively on the franchise, on the FDD, but just go ahead and do your due diligence, as I mentioned that before, and just type those names and check them out. Okay, so you'll have that's item number 2 on the franchise disclosure document. Item number 3 is litigation history. This is very important because one of the things that they have to disclose is whether or not the franchisor or any executives have been convicted of any crimes. They have to, whether or not they have been liable for any type of breach of contract claim, whether a lawsuit has been settled. And it's not uncommon for a franchisor to be in some type of litigation, especially they've been around for a long time. So that in and of itself is not to now be deterrent for you to pursue a franchise business. It is very common, but it's also important to know, and that's where the attorney can help you. When you see a litigation listed there, you got to find out a little bit more. They're going to provide the minimum. The FTD is basically a required document, so they're not going to give you a long list of everything that happened in that lawsuit, who sued for what. It might be a small summary, and whether or not it got resolved or whether or not it's pending. Those are things that they will be listed in the FTD. Fortunately for you, pretty much all lawsuits are available in the public domain. Depending on the jurisdiction, the attorney can help you go online and basically pull those pleadings and take a look at the history of that case, look at the original lawsuit, whether it's the franchisor suing a franchisee, whether it's a lack of payment of royalties, whether it's trademark infringement, whatever the case may be. So the attorney can actually look at that lawsuit and tell you, okay, this is basically what happened. This is the way it got resolved. The settlements usually are not part of the public domain. Those are usually confidential, but they can tell you that it got settled. So at least understanding why is there a litigation, how long it was, whether it's actually pending as you're considering this particular franchise. So look at that. The attorney can help you analyze that. But in and of itself, that if you see a litigation history within the FTD, that in itself is not a red flag. It's simply something to look at. What happened, the facts within those lawsuits are really the key here. In some cases, you also find out whether or not there's arbitration claims. A lot of franchisors within their franchise agreement require an arbitration claim. That will not be arbitration provision, meaning that you have to go to an arbitration to resolve the disputes. That will not show up in the public documents. That will not show up in the court's website because it is not part of it. Is just a private court to a degree. So it is a good question to ask. If it's not listed here, are you involved in any arbitrations presently or in the last 3 or 4 years? So to get that information. So if it's not listed, you can ask that question. Item number 4 is bankruptcy. That's item number 4 of the FTD. And it's whether or not the franchisor, its affiliates, or any of its executives have filed for bankruptcy. And that's information that they have to provide to you. Then again, it's simply for information. If an executive, for instance, filed bankruptcy 10 years ago, I'm just not sure that's going to be an issue that to be considered or that an impediment for you to say, okay, things happen. But at the very least, there's information available and your attorney now can help you if it's something that of its concern that, an executive or the franchisor is in the middle of bankruptcy. You can actually get that information through PACER because it's federal law. So in pretty much you can get the pleadings, you can get the actual petition and find out, what are the circumstances perhaps that led this executive to be in that situation. But that in and of itself should not be a reason not to consider the franchise. It's something to look at, but it's one of the many factors, but at least you have it there. So this one has items number 5 through 7. So I'm going to go basically have it in the way they have it listed here so we can move faster in some of these topics. That's basically initial and other fees. And if you look at the FDD, you want to put attention to this particular category. That's basically your out-of-pocket cost on the franchise. The initial of other fees includes your startup costs. They give you an estimate. You know you have to pay a franchise fee. Now, I went over that in the last episode, and I'm going to go over that today as well. Usually, and this is something that I have a problem with franchises, is that they're required to pay, for the most part, a franchise fee that is non-refundable before you actually get a lease agreement and before you actually have the opportunity to evaluate the franchise fully. And that's usually non-refundable. In some cases, I've seen franchise fees can be $5,000, $10,000, but in some cases I've seen in $50,000 and above, depending on the franchise. And in my opinion, when the FDD is just not, it's a good baseline to do some due diligence on a franchise, but it is not necessarily it's not sufficient for you to really say, okay, I read the FDD, everything looks good, I'm going to go forward with it. There are a lot of considerations aside the FDD that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at a franchise. So I'll give you an example. You have a franchise fee. Is it refundable or non-refundable? I'll tell you the franchises that I've seen, for the most part, they're non-refundable franchise fees. And they say they require this in order for you to begin to look for a lease, look at location. Unless this is a service business that does not require a retail location, does not require an office or some type of brick and mortar store. For the most part, you will have a location that you'll have to lease. So in some cases, they say, okay, you go ahead and you pay the franchise fee. You have 90 days to find a location. It just does not make any sense because your location is really one of the most important decisions you're going to make in opening your business, whether it's a franchise or whether it's any other business that requires a storefront. That's a critical decision, yet you already put $50,000 down and then you're under the gun that you have to find a location to run that business before you receive training, before you find a lease, before you actually determine whether it's a place and also it has to be approved. It has to be approved by the franchisor. So what happens is this. So you pay the $50,000 for the franchise fee, and then you really have no choice but to find a location. And there are a lot of considerations for leases that we talked about that in a prior episode that you have to consider. If you're able to, this is a suggestion, if you're looking at a franchise and they say you need to put this franchise fee up front before we can continue talking, if you can negotiate, okay, I'll happy to do that if you want to, this is something you're interested in. However, you want some type of contract or addendum that states that if you are not able to secure a lease, that franchise fee is fully refundable. That is critical for you to have that. So that way, if you're not able to find a lease that you're happy with, not that they're happy with, that you're satisfied with, then you should be able to get that money back because you're not buying the franchise. That's something that association that I have. Their build-out cost, and that goes into the lease. So if this is the type of franchise that requires a build-out, and many franchises, for example, restaurant franchises have their own decor, they have their own theme, their own trade dress, and they have their own requirements and how you're going to decorate, how is that going to look, to make sure that the customer has the same experience on that franchise and that restaurant, for example, whether they're in Boca Raton or whether they're in Miami, whether they're in Tampa, whether they're in any other state or in a city. That's important to the franchisor. And that's what you're buying. You're buying that system. You're buying that marketing system. You're buying the trade dress. You're also buying that familiarity. And you're also buying the ability and to tap into the national advertising that this franchisor does, and then the name recognition that when somebody sees a McDonald's, logo, whether in Boca or they're in Minneapolis, they know what they're going to expect. So, but you got to do a build out for that. So if you're looking at a lease, then you have to not only talk to the landlord, you also need to talk to a general contractor to give you an estimate of what it's going to cost. So that's part of that items number 5 and 7 of the franchise disclosure documents. You're talking about initial inventory. You're talking about signs, equipment leases, rentals. Also, here in this particular section, you will learn how much you got to pay the franchisor in royalties. For every dollar you come in, what percentage of that dollar is going to the franchisor, and it's right from the top. That does not take into account your expenses. So say for sake of argument, the franchisor has a 10% royalty that has to be paid every month, and they will have access to all your POS, they will have access to your bank account, and that comes directly out of your ACH account. So it's not that you will have, okay, I'm going to get a bill from the franchisor, I'm going to write a check. No. The way it's going to work for the most part is that you will basically, they'll know what your sales are going in, what sales you're generating, and then perhaps in the 10th of the month of the following month, they're going to take the money from your account, regardless of what bills you have to pay. So you have to keep taking that into account when you're thinking about having a franchise. You also have some other costs like their advertising fees. For the most part, they require, and most franchisors require that you pay maybe a 3 or 5% advertising fee on top of your royalties. They use that money to be able to go ahead and buy their national advertising, regional advertising, to be able to continue promoting the brand, which you're benefiting from. And sometimes there are additional fees on top of that, whether they do a co-op advertising, whether franchise source might be like 2 or 3%, whether, there's a minimum requirement that you have to spend to advertise. So there are many charges within the franchise disclosure document that you got to add up in order to determine your business plan. So that is a very, very important section, and I'm actually spend more time in this section as well. You also have to look at what it's going to be costing for training. Training, sometimes you got to pay additional fees. You got to pay fees for professionals. And they include that in that section. They give you a whole table that breaks it down, and they give you a range, between this amount and this amount. This is basically what you expect to pay as startup costs. And there's a lot of footnotes there. It's important to look at the footnotes simply because that will give you an idea of what you will be expecting. And I think that one of the things that the I've seen this on only one FDD, and I'm going to close with this point before, and then go into the next segment the following week. It's important to know what is the average cost of the sale. And I've only seen this in one FDD that I saw recently. And it's important to know that what is the average, not the average cost, but the average ticket sale for the item that you're selling. Because that's going to help you develop a business plan that if the average item, and I'm just going to give you the restaurant example, if the average ticket is about $50 or $60 per ticket per order, then how many of those orders will you need to meet your expenses, lease agreement, to meet your insurance requirements, to meet all the infrastructure that you got to build in order to be able to operate this business. So it's important to know that. And sometimes it's including the FDD, sometimes it's not including the FDD. Inventory, whether you can buy it outside of the franchise or within the franchisor. In most cases, any inventory that is something that is consumed, that is given to the customer, you will only be able to buy directly from them or their suppliers. So those are the things you need to do. So you got to spend a great deal of time in this section. So for today, we went over 5 items, actually 5 to 7, but I basically did it up to 5. So you have the franchisor's background, the business background, litigation history, the bankruptcy, and whether or not it's bankruptcy and the initial and other fees of the FDD, and those items 5 to 7. Next week, I'm going to go over territory, restrictions, suppliers, advertising, and some other items. But I think for today, this is good. I will have this information came straight from the Federal Trade Commission website. I'm going to put a link in my show notes, so that way if you want to go and take a look at it, you're welcome to download this document as well. And if you want a link, you want to send me an email to rich@richsierra.com. I'm happy to give you the link and you can download it yourself. Again, the more information you have about franchises, if you're thinking about going into one, the better prepared you will be and the better questions you're going to be able to ask, and you're going to have more of a benefit when you talk to an attorney about, listen, I'm considering going to this franchise. You'll have a much productive conversation with the attorney because you'll be prepared to answer more intelligent questions because you actually have some knowledge as to what to ask. So let me close today. If you need to reach me, you can reach me at rich@richsierra.com. If you need to, interested in my legal services, go to floridasmallbusinesslegalcenter.com. We also have a YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about us and want to watch this via YouTube, it's youtube.com/RichardSierra. If you want to, interested in, give us a call. Number is 866-842-5202. The Business SOS, 8 Common Legal Mistakes business owners make and how to avoid them. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and you can find it in your local bookstores. If you like the podcast, please follow us and give us a review. And you can also share it with your friends. Remember, until next week, this is Rich Sierra with the Florida Small Business Legal Center. Remember that my goal is to help you succeed.